Thank you. It's a great honor to be here back in Korea, where innovation is so highly valued. Innovation is the lifeblood of social and economic change. So we need innovation. And the question is, how are you going to change the world? What will you do? Where will you begin? How can you ensure your success? So I'd like to give you 7 strategies born of 30 years of my own research into creativity and doing research management for major companies. These 7 strategies are imagine, question, doubt, constrain, train, match, and act. All right. So, imagine. Many of you are probably aware of the book that I wrote with my wife called Sparks of Genius, where we broke down the intuition that is behind great ideas into 13 thinking tools, which are listed here. Things like abstracting, imaging, observing, empathizing, body thinking, playing. I'm not going to discuss those in detail here today because you can read them in the book. But what I would like to do is to tell you about new ideas that we had as a result of writing that book. And one of them is that many of the creative people we studied did something very unusual, which is they did world playing. There we go. So world play is the idea of inventing an imaginary world, the world that you would like to live in. Not the world that exists now, but something imaginary you would like to create. Most creative people do this. And when we finished writing Sparks of Genius, my wife spent 10 years doing the first detailed study of world play and found that it is probably the best correlate to creativity and innovation. Imagining is critical. Now, this may sound very strange if you're thinking about something that's technical or scientific. So I want to give you a quote from a Nobel Prize winner, which relates directly to imagining a new world. This is Francois Jacob, a Nobel Prize winner in physiology. And he says, "I came to understand that, contrary to what I had believed, the march of science does not advance along the royal road of human reason or result necessarily and inevitably from the conclusive observations dictated by experiment and argumentation. Rather, I found that science is a mode of playfulness and imagination. The game was that of continually inventing a possible world and then comparing it to the real one. And from that comparison, you then discover challenges." Now, Jacob is not alone in saying this. For example, Albert Einstein has said that the gift of fantasy meant more to me than my talent for positive knowledge. George Lucas, who was the founder of Lucasfilm, Pixar, THX Limited, and many other companies, says that dreams are extremely important. You can't do unless you can imagine it. And then a writer, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who said that if you want to build a ship, don't hire people or gather people together to collect wood and don't assign them the work, but rather teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea. You need to convince people of your vision, of your imagination. So start with a vision. What do you want to do? How do you want to change the world? Imagine that world, play with it, compare it to the real world, and then discover the challenges inherent in the differences between the two. Next, you need to question. Every challenge needs to be broken down into addressable questions. So finding the right problem becomes the key to making your advance. Then you can search for solutions. And then if you work on the right problem and learn how to ask the right question, you're almost sure to succeed. Again, Albert Einstein as a good example. If I had an hour to solve a problem and my life depended on its solution, I would spend the first 55 minutes making sure that I had asked the right question. For once I know the proper question, it will only take me 5 minutes to answer it. Think about this. This is not what we teach our students. This is not how we operate our companies. We do not spend most of the time trying to make sure that we have the right question. We spend all our time trying to answer the question, and often we aren't even asking the right question. An example. Amoco Company, which is a major oil company in the United States, had a very interesting problem which involved unusable waste. This is how they perceived the problem. Imagine producing billions of gallons of oil and then having to pay $1 a barrel to get rid of an unusable waste product. If you could turn that waste into something usable, imagine the huge profit on billions of gallons of oil. So their perceived solution was the following: convene the most imaginative people in the company. Good thing to do. Give them 6 months or so to see if they can come up with a new solution. Invite an innovation guru to make sure that you're doing all this right. And I have to tell you, I was the innovation guru. And within 2 months, you think you've solved the problem. Within 4, you have a prototype of your new product, and you get ready to present it to the board of directors. Except you made some oversights. You didn't make sure that you were answering the right question. You didn't listen to your innovation guru, that's me again, who kept trying to tell you that this isn't just a technical problem of making a new product. You need to know what kind of product Amoco is willing to sell. Because every company has a certain view of what they do. And if you don't fit into that view of what the company is, your product won't get sold. It won't get made. What's the developmental time? How long do you have to get this product onto the market? How much is the company willing to spend? Are they willing to put resources such as new infrastructure into making it? These are the kinds of questions that you do not listen to. So you produce your new material, you go to the board, you tell them about this great breakthrough, and they ask all the questions that the innovation guru told you you should have answered, which you didn't. And the outcome is that the director of the project got fired. The group was disbanded. They were all sent back to their original groups. Many of them were so unhappy with the outcome that they left the company, so you lost your most creative people. And as far as I know, the problem remains unsolved. All because you didn't ask the right question and found out too late that your innovation wasn't an innovation. This is not atypical. Jonas Salk, who I studied with, he developed the first polio vaccine, said, unfortunately, that what people think of as the moment of discovery is often the discovery of the question that you should have been asking. A problem well stated, said Charles Kettering, who was the chief scientist at General Motors, is a problem half solved. Very much the same thing that Einstein said. My greatest strength as a consultant is to be ignorant and ask a few questions, said Peter Drucker, who is certainly one of the greatest management consultants in the world. And Anthony Jay, who is a writer, I think summed it up the best. The uncreative mind can spot wrong answers, but it takes a very creative mind to spot wrong questions. Okay, so how do you get those wrong questions? Know that they're wrong. You have to doubt. With regard to persistent questions and problems and challenges, there's a very simple principle. You can't trust the experts. If experts had the solutions to your problems, you wouldn't have the problem. It's amazing how many people, however, hire experts to solve what they know they can't solve. So there's a conundrum here, which is you brought me in as an expert to tell you about my expertise, but I'm telling you you can't trust me. How are you going to solve this problem? All right, while you think about that, let me give you an example of this doubting. So Charles Kettering, who I mentioned before, the chief scientist for General Motors, said, if I want to stop a research project, if I want to destroy it, keep it from making progress, I can always do it by getting a few experts to sit in on the subject and tell me why it can't be done. That's what experts are good for. Experts said we could never fly. The Wright brothers proved them wrong. In the 1950s, the experts told all the major oil companies in the world that there was no oil under the Arabian Peninsula. But a crazy little company called Gulf Oil decided to invest anyway. Well, we know the outcome there. In 1978, experts claimed that there would never be a market for home computers. I know that for a fact. My father was one of the first computer scientists. He helped write that particular report. He's usually a very creative guy. He missed the boat. Apple was already on the market, changing the world. So Kettering again, I don't want the person who can tell me why something can't be done. I want any number of people will tell me that. I want the person who will tell me how it can be done. And that's usually not an expert. So how do you solve the problem, which I posed to you earlier, which is you can't trust the experts. I'm an expert telling you these things. What do you do? You have to trust yourself. This is not something we usually do, particularly in a corporate culture. But this is why Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak went out on their own to found Apple. All the experts told them it couldn't be done. This is why Bill Gates went out on his own to find Microsoft. IBM and the other companies wouldn't support him. This is why Mark Zuckerberg went off on his own to found Facebook. You can go on and on. The challenge that companies have is how to keep the innovators inside by giving them enough freedom to work the way their vision tells them to work and not to constrain them with so many experts they can't do their job. Next, you have to constrain. A clear problem statement contains within it all of the elements defining its solution. So making your problem statements as constrained as possible actually helps you. There are a number of books I would recommend. Creativity from Constraints and Thinking Inside the Box are two very good ones. The problem is most people equate creativity with breaking rules. Out-of-the-box thinking, brainstorming, doing whatever you feel like. That's what people think creativity is, but it isn't. Because you don't want 1,000 crazy ideas that don't work. You want one good idea that does. So how do you get that one good idea? Let me give you an example. the standard shipping container. Everything in the world is now shipped in one size of box. It can be put on rail cars, it can be put on trucks, it can be put on ships. It is the ultimate in constraining everything to one size fits all. And it revolutionized transportation and delivery of materials. So let me show you how I've actually used this approach of constraining and trying to put everything inside a very tight box to help Chiron Corporation, which is a pharmaceutical company in California, solve one of its problems. So here was the challenge. Chiron was one of the first companies to make what are called combinatorial libraries of chemicals, literally millions upon millions of compounds. These were usually made to solve a particular problem. Let's make a million compounds to try to find a drug to treat heart disease or a drug to treat Alzheimer's disease. And then they were left, and you can actually see on the left-hand part of the image here, with literal libraries of compounds which they would put on shelves. And I asked them, what were they doing with this tremendous resource? And they said, nothing. Once we've tested them, then we just store them. I said, well, that's crazy. You've got millions and millions, potentially billions of dollars of potentially new drugs sitting there in this library. You should do something with them. And they said, well, here's the problem. The problem is we don't know what else is in there. So how are we going to manage to find things? And I said, well, first of all, find a new use for them. And the use I came up with was trying to find new antibiotics. There are many, many bacteria. Staphylococcus aureus is one, which are now resistant to every antibiotic on the market. People are dying because there's nothing to treat them anymore. Why don't we try to find a new type of antibiotic in these millions and millions of compounds? So I went to the head of research at Chiron and suggested the idea, and he said, that's fine, but here are the constraints. I don't have any budget for you. I can't give you any personnel. There's no equipment available. The standard techniques are far too expensive. They take far too much manpower. The equipment is not available anyway because we've already committed it for the next couple of years to other projects. But if you can figure out a way to do this search for new antibiotics without any budget, any people, or equipment, go ahead and do it. Sounds impossible, doesn't it? Well, I have a very odd background. I'm a historian of science. I actually knew of a case where somebody had already done this, and this was Alexander Fleming, who discovered penicillin. This is his entire laboratory. It was a little room about 8 by 10 feet. He had no budget. He worked by himself. There was no equipment, and yet he managed to come up with the first antibiotic, the first miracle drug ever. How did he do it? Well, he simply took a bunch of petri dishes. He would grow things like molds on them. You can see the vertical stripe there is simply a mold that he'd grown, penicillin in this case. He allowed whatever was in it to diffuse into the agar. He then plated a whole bunch of bacteria, which are the horizontal stripes. And you can see at the bottom there are some stripes missing. That's because the antibiotic had killed them all. And in fact, this is Staphylococcus aureus. So I said, somebody's done this before. So I ran around Chiron and I said, is there anybody interested in this project? The head of bacteriology said, I am. This sounds really exciting. This could be a huge breakthrough. I told her, we can't hire anybody. We've got no budget. She said, no problem. She got 4 other people to volunteer, one of whom was actually a computer scientist with no background whatsoever. They came in on weekends and nights. They did the experiments of just dropping these compounds onto plates. And within 6 weeks, they had discovered 2 new classes of broad-spectrum antibiotics. Within 3 months, they had filed patents, and within 6 months, this was the lead project at the company. all without any budget, any people, or any equipment. The constraints told us what we had to do. I will just tell you very briefly, this is still an area in which there is a great deal of research going on. Next, you need to train. If you can't trust expertise, you can't think outside the box, you're severely constrained in how you can approach your problem, how do you increase your ability to solve these problems? Well, you have to expand your box so it will fit the kinds of problems you want to solve. This is an image showing in the yellow how much air a normal jogger breathes in a minute of running. The blue box, which is a lot larger, is the amount of air that is breathed by a trained marathon runner. This is an analogy for what you have to do with your mind. You can expand your mind so that the box of ideas that you can bring to bear on a problem is much larger. How do you do this? You do it by being a polymath, a person trained in multiple different fields. Here's an example. Robert R. Wilson was an inventor of high-energy particle physics cyclotrons. Very, very complicated physical machinery. You can see him in the center there. He was also a professional sculptor, and when he got the opportunity to build a new cyclotron at a new facility, he also became the architect of that building you see there in which the cyclotrons were housed. He said all of those skills came from the same kind of thinking. It made him think about all of his problems in different ways. This is not atypical. Here is a chart that shows a study we did in Michigan. The light gray bars are the avocations of average scientists and engineers in Michigan. They're all very successful. You can see many of them play music, many of them are photographers, and so forth. These people compete for money to found new companies. They have to have patents. They have to get money from something called the MEDC, Michigan Economic Development Corporation. The people who got that funding are the ones who are entrepreneurs and innovators. And you can see that they differ from the average scientist and engineer in being much more artistic, having crafts, understanding electronics, and so forth. They are polymaths. They bring new skills to their work that the average scientist and engineer doesn't have. They pay attention to things like innovations in the arts. This is a Tensegrities sculpture invented by my friend Ken Snelson, who is a sculptor. It's a totally new way of building structures. He even got patents, such as the one on the left for these. And it's led to an entire new version of engineering. Here is a Tensegrity bridge. It is the lightest, strongest bridge ever built. And of course, I had mentioned before, I use my history. There is no right way to be a polymath. The object is to be idiosyncratic, to be different, to bring new and unusual skills, a different skill set to the set of problems and challenges that you imagine. Because the more different you are, the more different you think, the more the probability you will see problems that other people don't and end up with new solutions they don't understand. Sixth, you need to match. You need to match the boxes of the problem with your skills. We tend to, again, hire the expert because it's an engineering problem, we need an engineer. Well, that's not necessarily the case. You need to find a match between the challenge. Let me give you an example. Again, I ended up consulting for the first company that ever developed a robotic chemical synthesis system. These were the first robots to make hundreds or thousands of chemicals all at the same time for these combinatorial libraries that I mentioned earlier. The person who developed these was Sheila Hobbs Dewitt. She was, as I've just mentioned, a craftsperson and artist. She loved to make things. She had been doing it since a child. She was one of the actual inventors of combinatorial chemistry, which took place at Parke Davis. She was a group leader in that operation. And so in 1992, Parke Davis decided they would spin off a new company to make these robotic systems. Sheila Dewitt did a fantastic job of actually designing the robotic systems, building the prototypes, making them work, at which point she needed some new resources. She needed a robotics expert so that they could actually make the best possible robots. She needed a chemical engineer so that they could optimize the chemistry. They needed a person who could do the programming for the robot so it would have the best interface for the user. They needed actually a person in the mailroom just to package and ship the robots. They'd never done anything like that before. And Parke Davis said, no. We only hire chemists. If you can't find a chemist to do it, we won't help you. The company failed. Not because DeWitt was the wrong person. She had exactly the right skills. She actually built the robots. But because Parke Davis wouldn't support her with the resources necessary to do it, they didn't understand what the problem was they were getting involved in. And the result is another failure, not for the reasons that Amoco, but a different reason altogether. DeWitt, by the way, has gone on to found out 2 more companies, extremely profitable, one of which he just sold to one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world for a very large amount of money. So it wasn't her. My final strategy is to act. I've already told you there are many, many people who will tell you what you can't do. They'll tell you why you can't do it. They won't give you resources. They won't give you money. They won't give you equipment. It would be easy to say, well, then I can't do anything. But I've already shown you that you can. If you understand your problem and you have a vision, you can make things happen. So as Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Motor Company, said, I'm looking for people, a lot of people, who have an infinite capacity to not know what can't be done. No one ever succeeded by waiting for permission. There's always something you can do. There's always some way to begin. So do it. Act. Every change begins with a dream. What's your dream? Every act begins in the imagination. What do you imagine? Every innovation begins with an individual. What innovation will you make? And every transformation requires risk. What will you risk? If you can imagine, question, doubt, constrain, train, match, and act, you can go change the world. Good luck, and thank you very much.